It is not the style of poetry we care to publish in our columns, said the editor of The Leader, a conservative newspaper based in Melbourne, Australia. This rather priggish retort was published on the 17th of December 1892 in response to a request from Garup, a reader who was looking for the words of the Wild Colonial Boy. We simply do not know who composed this ballad, which seems to have slowly emerged in Australia in the middle of the 19th century. But we can say for certain is that it celebrated the life and times of that rebellious Irishman, John or Jack Donohoe. Born in Dublin around 1807, in 1824 Jack was convicted of stealing, for which he was sentenced to transportation to Australia. Together with 200 other convicts, he arrived in Sydney Cove on the 2nd of January 1825 on board the Anne and Amelia, a 558-ton prison ship that had sailed out of Cork. While being put to work on Major West's farm at Quakers Hill, about 40 kilometres north of Sydney, Jack managed to escape his captors, but was soon apprehended. In February 1827, he was found guilty of having committed highway robbery, and a few weeks later, the Supreme Court found him guilty as charged and sentenced him to death by hanging. But while being escorted from the court building to Sussex Street Jail, he made a successful bolt for freedom. Donohoe then joined a band of outlaws, or bushrangers, which was sometimes led by William Underwood, a 28-year-old felon who hailed from County Antrim. For the next 3 years, Donohoe and Underwood would become the scourge of the gentry in New South Wales, carrying out a series of armed robberies in places such as Windsor, Bathurst, Prospect, Penrith, Parramatta, and of course, Sydney. Described by the Sydney Monitor as modern Robin Hoods, this fearless duo operated with military precision. When staging a stick-up, they often hid their horses in the bush, then lay in wait beside a nearby road, each watching out for any well-dressed horseman or a gig carrying respectable-looking passengers. All of a sudden, they would appear from the thicket, stop their prey at the point of a gun, and secure from them items such as gold watches, jewellery, or cash. However, as the following story will illustrate, Donohoe and Underwood didn't just confine themselves to trinkets and money. In late November 1829, they stopped a cart laden with enough food to provide breakfast for a small army. The cart driver was a servant employed by Robert Crawford, a trader based in Prospect. Leaving the driver unharmed, they made off with £1,000 of flour, a chest of tea, and a large bag of sugar. Life on the Renegade Road clearly had its perks. In Windsor, in August 1830, shortly after robbing 2 carts filled with rum, India prints, and earthenware, the property of a Mr. McQuaid, eyewitnesses could not help but notice that Donohoe had an expensive brace of pistols in a belt around his waist and was wearing a fashionable blue frocked coat lined with silk. In the wake of the Windsor stick-up, rumours abounded that Underwood had been murdered by Donohoe, but what we know for certain is that Donohoe joined forces with 2 other brazen bushrangers, namely John Walmsley and William Webber. When all 3 embarked on a campaign of wholesale robbery, the Colonial Secretary of New South Wales, Scottish-born Alexander MacLeay, determined that his constables and soldiers would bring Donohoe and his troublesome gang to heel, dead or alive. A wanted poster described Donohoe as being age 23, 5 foot 4 inches in height, freckled complexion, flaxen hair, blue eyes, and has a scar under the left nostril. Most likely acting on a tip-off, a group of mounted police, accompanied by troops attached to the 39th Regiment, spent an entire week lying in wait for the Bushrangers at a creek near Brengelly, a suburb of Sydney. When they finally spotted the outlaws at 5 p.m. on the 1st of September 1830, Constable Michael Gorman called on all three to surrender, at which point Donohoe drew his gun, defiantly waved his hat in the air and replied, "Come on, you cowardly rascals, we're ready if there's a dozen of you." I suspect the Dubliner used a more colourful word than rascals. As Walmsley and Webber made good their escape through the dense undergrowth, and as a barrage of bullets ripped into trees and ricocheted off rocks, Private John Muggleston, a red-coated sharpshooter with the 39th, fired his carbine from a distance of 100 yards, the shot killing Donohoe instantly. And that was how they really captured him, the Wild Colonial Boy. At Donohoe's inquest, the jury returned a verdict of justifiable homicide. Curiously, while his lifeless body was lying in the morgue, a death mask was made of his face, all in the name of science, of course. This gruesome artefact was housed at the Australian Museum until 1897, when it fell into the hands of the Anatomy Museum at Sydney University. It was later photographed, but the artefact itself is presently untraceable. As for Walmsley, he subsequently turned state's evidence and was given a pardon for his trouble. But Webber was less fortunate. He was apprehended and hanged in July 1831. And so again to the ballad, a heady mix of fact and fiction. The anonymous writer clearly decided to err on the side of safety, opting not to disclose the actual names of the police and soldiers involved in Donohoe's death. Hardly at all surprising, since many of those involved were most probably still alive when the verses were written. Moreover, the writer changed the name of the central character to Jack Duggan, and gave his birthplace as Castlemaine. These were wise choices, as in 19th century Australia, a singer could be imprisoned for extolling in song the heroic virtues of a recently deceased bushranger. As the ballad became popular, Duggan was changed to Dowling, then Doohan, and to various other Irish-sounding surnames beginning with the letter D. And so ends the story of Jack Donohoe, the Wild Colonial Boy. There was a wild colonial boy, Jack Duggan was his name. He was born and raised in Ireland, in a place called Castlemaine. He was his father's only son, his mother's pride and joy. And dearly did his parents love the wild colonial boy. At the early age of 16 years, he left his native home, and to Australia's sunny shores he was inclined to roam. He robbed the rich, he helped the poor, he shot James McAvoy. A terror to Australia was the wild colonial boy. One morning on the prairie, as Jack he rode along, a little listening to the mockingbird singing its cheerful song. Up stepped a band of troopers, Kelly, Davis and Fitzroy. They all set out to capture him, the wild colonial boy. Surrender now, Jack Duggan, for you see we're 3-1. Surrender in the King's high name, you are a plundering son. Jack drew 2 pistols from his belt, and he proudly waved them high. I'll fight, but not surrender, said the wild colonial boy. He fired a shot at Kelly that brought him to the ground, and turning round to Davis he received a fatal wound. A bullet pierced his proud young heart from the pistol of Fitzroy, and that was how they captured him, the wild colonial